the election of Zelensky will not necessarily lead to a catastrophic change in Ukrainian-Russian relations. The reasons for that are that Russia is Russia and Putin is Putin. The idea that somehow a new candidate can lead to a breakthrough in relations is naive and has simply no basis in fact. The same thing happened, well, what is it now, 25 years ago, in 1994. Leonid Kuchma was elected to power with similar kind of naivety as an Eastern Ukrainian. He said, forget the nationalist Kravchuk, elect me and I'll resolve all the relations problems we have in relations with Russia. Well, people believed him. What happened? Took Yeltsin 3 years to travel to Kiev to sign the treaty with the Ukraine on the border. In the meantime, Kuchma got so fed up of Russia dragging its heels, and this was Yeltsin, not Putin, of dragging its heels, that he turned westward and began to cultivate very good relations with Bill Clinton's USA and with NATO. So we've seen it all before, this naivety about Russia. And Zelensky is full of that kind of, because of his inexperience in international relations and because of maybe he's a Russian speaker from Eastern Ukraine. But the reality on the ground is that nothing will, there will be no breakthrough. Why? Well, firstly, how can you have a breakthrough on the Crimea when Russia has said all along that there's nothing to discuss? The Crimea is a closed question for Russian leaders. So what does a Ukrainian president have to do to unblock that? I have no idea. There's simply nothing that they can do to convince Russia to say, okay, we agree, fine, we're going to give you the Crimea back. Are you serious? I mean, it's not going to happen. So Ukrainian public opinion does believe the Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Any Ukrainian presidential candidate who tries to introduce something similar to what Viktor Pinchuk proposed a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal, that, well, we'll do a deal on the Crimea with Russia, then Russia will go easy with us and do a peace deal on the Donbass, is blowing it out of their you-know-where. There is simply not possible to do that. Firstly, a president of a country like Ukraine is the guarantor of the territorial integrity of the country. He or she cannot give away bits of territory at their own whim. That's not they don't have the right in the constitution to do that. And secondly, even if he wanted to do that, why would Parliament, the government agree to it? Why would political parties, civil society, veterans groups agree to it? Nobody would agree to it. So he could not do that even if he wanted to, or even if he thought of doing it. But more importantly, it wouldn't work to Ukraine's advantage because Western sanctions are premised not only on the Donbass, but also on the Crimea, on Russia's occupation. So Western sanctions against Russia will continue as long as Russia's occupying the Crimea. And the Ukrainian and Russian positions on the Crimea are diametrically different. And Zelensky will never be able to change that. 85% of Russians, according to a poll this month by the Levada Center, believe that the annexation of the Crimea was the right thing. Putin was right. This is not a small number of people. Only 10% of Russians disagreed, thought it was wrong. So it has massive support, way beyond Putin. This is not just Putin here. Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, supports the annexation. On the Ukrainian side, the same number of people, 70 to 80%, believe the Crimea belongs to Ukraine. So how do you reconcile these two diametrically opposite viewpoints? It's simply impossible. That's one thing. Secondly, Zelensky might be surprised to see that Russian influence in Ukraine through social media, through soft power, has dramatically declined in the last 4 or 5 years. Ukrainian trade is now 5 times greater with the EU than with Russia. Travel to Russia has collapsed. People don't travel there anymore, whereas they are traveling to Europe. Train services to Russia are being cut. Train services to Europe are being increased. Many airlines, particularly discount airlines, are moving into Ukraine this year. So Ukraine is fundamentally changed. Any president coming in is going to have to deal with that situation. You can't turn the clock back. You can't sort of press a video recorder to go back to pre-2014 when you've had something like 30,000 civilians and combatants killed and massive destruction. Zelensky will have to deal with the fact that Ukrainian polls say that there are 4 prerequisites for peace with Russia or reconciliation with Russia. Firstly, return the Crimea. Secondly, stop your military aggression in the Donbass. Now, how can Zelensky get Russia to do that when Putin claims we're not in the Donbass? So, and then thirdly, for Russia to pay reparations for all the damages it's done in eastern Ukraine. And fourthly, for Russia to stop all its interference in Ukraine's domestic and foreign affairs. Now, those seem to be quite reasonable demands on the part of Ukraine, but I somehow doubt that Zelensky or any Ukrainian president is going to be able to convince Moscow to go along with them. So you have 2 fundamental problems. Ukrainian-Russian views of these conflicts are totally irreconcilable. Russians believe the annexation of the Crimea was correct. Ukrainians don't. Russians keep claiming that they're not involved in the Donbass conflict, that this is a civil war between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. No Ukrainians, according to public opinion, believe this, and they believe it's a product of Russian military aggression, and that Russia wants to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty. So when you have this kind of hardened position in Moscow, when you have this kind of public opinion in Ukraine, Zelensky is not going to be able to change much, even though he's going to claim he is. So he's going to fall down on at least 3 areas very quickly, and his support is going to collapse. Firstly, he's claimed to be fighting corruption. Well, that's great, but if you start giving things back to Kolomoisky like Privat Bank, you can't claim you're fighting corruption. That cost the Ukrainian government something like 15 billion to cover all of the money that was stolen by Kolomoisky. Secondly, to quickly increase Ukrainian standards of living. Again, that is not simply physically possible for any government to do. And thirdly, to bring peace to the war in eastern Ukraine. Again, that's not possible. So the kind of populist, this is typical of populists everywhere, whether it's Brazil, the US, Ukraine, or elsewhere. They make these very nice promises which are impossible to keep when they come to power. And we can see that with Trump in his first term in office has been hardly unable to do anything of the demands or the proposals he made during the election campaign. And that's the same thing going to be with Zelensky. So I understand the concerns of Zelensky as president, because he is also commander-in-chief, and he could make some disastrous decisions to do with the war in eastern Ukraine. But the idea that somehow he could sell out Ukraine is, I think, a bit far-fetched, because there are too many places that would be able to control him. Firstly, Russian chauvinism and Russian inability to compromise prevents any kind of deal from happening. And Russia's not going to go halfway and do a deal with Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine to basically surrender. He wants Ukraine to capitulate. And Zelensky might be willing to do that, but that's not true of Ukrainians. Opinion polls show only 16% of Ukrainians are willing to do anything, i.e. even surrender, to end the war. I'm sure that 16% are people living very close to the war zone who are just fed up of war on a daily basis. But 70% do not agree with that. Strong civil society, veterans groups, and the fact that these Ukrainians and Russians look upon the Donbass and the Crimea in totally opposite ways. So I do not see how Zelensky can, even if he bends on his knees and crawls to Putin, as he said he would be willing to do, how that would somehow lead to a breakthrough in peace. So yes, there are dangers ahead because Ukraine's electing a commander-in-chief as well as a president at a time of war. And certainly many of Ukraine's soldiers on the front line are very concerned about a potential Zelensky presidency. But let's not forget the fact that there are many factors here inhibiting any potential kind of treasonous betrayal of Ukraine in the same manner as what happened under Yanukovych. This is a very different Ukraine to what Ukraine was like 10 years ago. Then Yanukovych had a presidential system, he can do what he wanted, and he had a massive political machine. Zelensky has a parliamentary constitution, he has no political machine, and he simply is not an operator like the Yanukovyches of this world were. So I'm concerned, but I also know that Ukraine will live through any potential Zelensky presidency. Thank you.